Hey gang, welcome back to another video. As you know, I'm always looking for new and interesting additions to our Halloween display. And after seeing Zach of the Prop Agenda channel hack this Hauntley's prop for a Hatbox Ghost build, it gave me an idea for a project of my own, also inspired by the Haunted Mansion. But before I can get into that, I'm going to need to build a base. So let's get into it. I started off this build as I do with most and sketched out my design. Everything would need to be based off the size of the animated prop head, which is 9 inches top to bottom. So from there, I derived the rest of my measurements. Once I had that taken care of, I could jump straight to cutting the foam for the bust part of this build. As with all of my tombstones, I'm using 2-inch XPS insulation foam, but EPS beaded foam would work just the same. I like to use a pull saw for making my rough cuts, since it doesn't leave as big of a mess as a jigsaw does. I mean, it leaves a mess, just not as big of a mess. And when I have all 4 pieces cut, I can get to gluing them together. As usual, I'm using Gorilla Glue to bond all of the pieces together. I have an entire video on foam adhesives that explains why this is my favorite, and I'll link to it in the video description if you want to check it out. While I waited for the glue to set, I shifted my attention to creating the pedestal for the bust. It just so happened to work out that my offcuts from the bust are just the right height for it, so after making a few measurements, I can cut down the foam and start building the base. But before I do that, I want to make sure all of my edges are nice and smooth, so I'll use my palm sander with 60 grit paper to square up all the cut edges. This part of the base is pretty straightforward. The front and back pieces are 11 inches wide, and the sides are 7 to give me even faces. I find that it helps to keep the measurements to whole numbers, both to minimize errors and to simplify the math. Once the pieces are glued up, I'll use some skewers inserted at about 45 degrees to help hold everything together. You could also use painter's tape for this, but I think skewers do a better job. After everything is dried, I'll grab my palm sander again and flatten the top and bottom of the box. This helps to blend everything together, as well as gives me a flat surface to glue against when it's time to add the foot and cap. I'll also take this opportunity to blend the vertical edges of the foam, since they always tend to move a bit as the glue expands and dries. Next up is adding the foot and cap to the box. These pieces are 13 inches square and will be glued together just as I've done with the other pieces of foam. And rather than skewering them together, I'll use a paint can as a weight. While the base dries, I can shift my attention over to the bust. I made myself a template and will trace it onto the foam, and then can get to roughing out the shape with my pull saw. When I have the rough shape cut, I switch over to my palm sander again to help smooth everything over. This helps me to visualize what it'll look like and what additional areas will need to be removed. The next element to add to the bust section is some kind of pedestal for it to rest on. So after a quick trip to my local hardware store to pick up a plastic urn, I separated the 2 pieces, but I needed to add some foam to my base so that I had something to mount it to. So I grabbed some 1-inch foam and cut it down to size. Then I could glue it to the cap and set it aside to dry. The next thing on my list was to get the plastic urn part mounted to the foam bust. So I took a quick measurement and hollowed out a part of the foam to match the shape of the urn, and then glued it in place, followed by some screws for added security. The bust is finally starting to look like something. But this was really the most challenging part of the build for me, and that's figuring out this overall shape. I had a general idea of what I wanted it to look like, and rather than get stuck and be unable to make a decision,
I grabbed a hot knife and got to cutting away the foam. I figured this might help me to see the shape as I removed some of the bulk, and when I got to a place where it was looking like what I'd imagined, I switched over to my rasp and got to refining the shape. After removing some more of the foam, I was still struggling with the overall shape, and whenever I feel like something isn't working right, I find that shifting to another part of the build can help. So I grabbed my router with a decorative cutting bit and added some details to the foot and cap of the base. And anywhere that I had a gouge, I turned into a crack by picking away at it with a small blade. That's the beauty of making old tombstones. There are rarely mistakes because they can almost always be turned into details. Next, I set up my hot wire table and got to cutting some trim pieces from 1-inch foam. This should help to give the base a bit more dimension and make it look a little less boring. And once I had all my pieces cut, I could glue them in place and hold them in position with some painter's tape. While I waited, I thought it might look nice to add a chamfer to the cap, so I grabbed my palm sander again and sanded in the detail. I also sanded down the 1-inch foam piece so that the plastic urn would fit a bit better. At this point, I still wasn't happy with how the bust was looking. But after a consultation with Mrs. Van Oaks where she was able to help point out how it could be improved, I decided that this would be a good time to step away, because it's important to remember that some things you just can't rush.
Now, I'd hoped to be further along in this build, but my overthinking got the best of me. Thankfully, there's still plenty of time before Halloween to finish it. But I won't make you wait that long, since I'll have it all figured out just in time for next week's video. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.